G'day cocktail lovers. I'm going to do something a little different today. It's a whiskey tasting, and the reason I'm doing this, I'm going to do a blind taste to see if I can pick this out, because this is new on the market in Australia and it's cheap. Most Australian whiskies are notably more expensive than the big international brands because they're made by smaller independent distilleries, so their production costs are higher, quality's higher too, in my opinion. But I saw this the other day. I always use like a bottle of Jack Daniels as my measuring stick. Most of the whiskies I have from Australian distilleries cost at least 2 bottles of Jack Daniels. This is 1 bottle of Jack Daniels. It was on a slight special, but it made it the same price as a bottle of Jack Daniels. It's called Hunter's End, but it isn't tied to any distillery. This is the equivalent of a Kirkland brand. This is in a supermarket chain in Australia called Coles. They have bottle shops. What I think has happened is someone has purchased a massive load of ethanol. There is a factory that makes ethanol for a lot of distillers, and then they've just, I don't know, chucked it in some barrels in a warehouse somewhere, and when it's reached the number of years it has to be called whiskey, because they are calling it whiskey, Australian grain whiskey, then they've bottled it. Or possibly they're getting one of the distilleries to do it for them. I don't know, but it has no distillery's name on it. No way of knowing where it comes from, but my guess is they're mass buying the new make spirit from a wholesaler, and then someone is aging it in barrels. This is interesting to me because what this is saying is the big chains have gone, wow, Australian whiskey's on the up, but it's a bit pricey. And if people have gotten into this idea of Australian whiskey, could we make a cheaper Australian whiskey? This is what they've come up with. So I'm going to run it, and I'm going to get real serious. Like, I'm not putting it up against other cheap whiskies. And this is where you find out how bad my palate is. Because in a blind taste, I'm going to compare it to this one, Starward's Nova Single Malt. This is the one I always say is my favourite. It's only 40% ABV. This is interestingly 38% ABV. People don't usually dilute their whiskey that much. But then I'm going to throw in some serious ones. This is Bakery Hill's Doublewood Single Malt. That's 46% ABV. This one's from Archie Rose in Sydney. This is their single malt whiskey, which was aged in rum cask. This is the cask strength version. I recently did a blind taste test with 16 whiskies, and this was my favourite out of all of those in a blind taste test. So I thought, you know what? I'll do a blind taste with this as well. I was out of the room. Mrs. Angry moved all the little glasses around, so I don't know which is which. I'm also not going to look at them because I know they're different colours, and if I even look down, it'll tip me off as to which is which. But now I'm going to do the tasting and see if I can pick the cheap whiskey. Time to go in for a tasting. This one. It smells quite nice. So I immediately think it's not the cheap one. With the asterisk, I'm really bad at this. Yeah, that is pretty nice. I really don't think that's the cheap one. Trying number 2. This might be the cheap one. Oh no, that's got too much kick to be the cheap one. Final one. Ah, I'm so bad at this. I don't want to rush to a decision, but I think this is the cheap one. I am definitely going to embarrass myself and get this wrong, but I think this is the cheap one, and it isn't. Oh, it's the Bakery Hill. They'll hate me for that. There's 3 left. Can I judge now? Okay, that one's tasting a bit subdued. Maybe that's the cheap one. What this is saying is the cheap one's not terrible. I had formed the opinion that was the rum cask one, and this tastes higher proof. This is the rum cask one. It's the rum cask one, and I think this is Nova. It's Nova, and this is the cheap one. I took a punt, and the first one I guessed was one of my most expensive whiskies, and one I like. But I did get it the second time when I narrowed it down a little. But I repeat, what this tells me is this is not terrible. It's not going to be my favourite or go-to, but I have made cocktails with it. It makes a perfectly decent old-fashioned. I think this is going to be aimed at people who want mixers. All in all, I think big chains wanting to get cheap Australian whiskey into the market is a good thing. I know some purists will be up in arms and they think it's cheapening the whole thing. I'm going to be glass half full about this. I think if it really gets into the mainstream, the idea of Australian whiskey, then people may start with a cheap one. Then they may hear, why these other ones? They cost a lot more. Are they that much better? And they are really good. Australian whiskies are really good. And this one is not to be sneezed at. I think it makes a really good mix-up. I don't think many people are going to be sitting down, drinking this out of a snifter and going, quality stuff. But as a mixer, I think this is quite good, and it maybe has a place in the market. I did see another similar one. It was slightly more expensive than this, about $10 more expensive than this, and it was the same thing. It was just called an Australian grain whiskey, wasn't tied to a distillery. So I think we might be seeing more of this in Australia, and as I said, I think it's a good thing because I think it will get more people in the mindset of try drinking Australian whiskey, and they might move from this to one of the really good ones. You know what, as shallow as this is, I really like the bottle too. It's got some embossing on it. It's quite nice. I will probably keep the bottle when it's empty for putting cocktails in and various other concoctions I come up with. I like slightly unusual bottles, so it's got that going for it as well. I wouldn't say that's the reason to buy it though. If you're in Australia and you've seen some of these cheaper whiskies, I'd be really interested in your opinion, if they're any good, or even just generally the idea of putting some cheaper whiskies out to get people more open to the idea of Australian whiskies. I think it's good. I'd be interested in what you think.